Good afternoon. We should start. Good afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Edgar Pieterse today and also introduce him. Edgar is someone, I've been for the last year wanting to get to the GSD and to get him here to share the work he's been doing, because I think he's really a significant and important figure, both in Africa but also globally, in the practice of planning and theorizing about planning. I think, the year I've been here, one of the things that has struck me in the academy, especially in planning, is the lack of practitioners that actually participate in the academy. And in contrast, in the South, in Africa and India, many parts of Asia, practice, theory is sort of happening on the move. It's happening simultaneously. And the challenge in locations like that is how you capture, how you reflect, how you construct theory from all that action on the ground. And if there's anyone I admire on that count, it's really Edgar. Because what he's been doing in Africa is precisely creating those bridges, is precisely kind of reflecting, capturing, theorizing, disseminating some of that knowledge, creating a discussion around questions of urbanism in Africa. And I mean, it's remarkable how much he's done besides the center which they've established for African cities. It's an alliance and a network that sort of encompasses several cities. It encompasses the whole continent virtually, but is also setting up some very, very interesting dialogues in the global South, which you will see, and I believe in the coming years, will play themselves out as being very, very important initiatives. He's also written extensively, and I think his contribution as an academic, as a theoretician, is important because he's also someone who I think very easily bridges the social sciences with design, with questions of the built environment, the initiatives that he's undertaken, where they have urbanists, planners, talking with artists, working with artists, working with visual artists, photographers, is absolutely incredible in terms of the sort of dialogues that they've been setting up around questions of urbanism in Africa. The center is also producing a really significant journal, which does precisely what I've described, and the voices here on urbanism come from an entire spectrum of professionals engaged in the field, including artists, photographers, social scientists, folks involved in activism, governance. And besides that, he's written several other books. One which is called City Futures. He's edited a book on sustainability and experiments in sustainability in Cape Town. He's currently working on another book on Cape Town, which is looking and challenging the regular conventional notions of densities. They've also produced the African Cities Reader, and it's an absolutely stunning range of things, and I think absolutely significant contribution. In many ways, I think what we are trying to do here at the GSD in a design school, in the way planning is situated, the kinds of dialogues we're trying to create between planning, urban design, landscape architecture, is all the stuff that Edgar is actually talking about and doing on the ground. So it gives me great pleasure welcoming Edgar. Thanks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Raul, for an incredibly over-generous introduction. It's obviously impossible to live up to an introduction to that. I don't have that much time, and so I'm going to really race through the discussion, through the presentation, so that we can get to some discussion points. What I want to cover today is really, if you will, the big picture backdrop that is vexing us as we're trying to build an interdisciplinary applied research center at the University of Cape Town. And what we're trying to do is to work simultaneously in the domains of practice, in the domains of the academy, to overcome all the traditional, conventional obstacles that faces any disciplinary-centered university, and also to move between, if you will, a sense of building a theoretical project around the aesthetic of the African city, its unique manifestations as it is emerging in the cauldron of all of these forces that I'll discuss in a second, but also think very, very pragmatically, and you will see why that is the case. So I want to just, this is one storyline. There's, of course, many, many, but the storyline is kind of the broadest one to present to help us to think about what the more specific intervention and theoretical questions may be, which I don't have time to reflect on today. In the conference the next 2 days, there'll be another occasion to touch on those aspects. But there's some peculiar stuff going on in Africa at the moment in the context of a pathological denial about the significance of urbanism in Africa. And so I'll touch on that, and then also towards the end speak a little bit about some of the conceptual frames that are emerging in our work and how we use that to think about how does one configure an applied research response within the African Center for Cities, which is a work of progress. So, of course, everybody here knows this fact. Africa manifests the fastest rate of urbanization in the world, but it's also, in most senses, the least prepared for this. And so if we, in broad terms, interested in a notion of an inclusive or resilient urbanism, you can't really find a better laboratory to exercise your mind. Of course, the broader context for this, most of you would be absolutely familiar with, but it's always good to remind ourselves that we're living right smack bang in the middle of one of the most dramatic urban transitions that as a species we've ever gone through, right? So we're trying to figure out, in an incredibly adverse global economic situation, in a dire environmental context, how to respond to this explosion of people that is coming into cities in Asia and Africa as we speak, and as that process will exercise itself and stabilize in around 40 years' time. But of course, what's different about this is that we've got to figure out how to do this in a context where we've destroyed the environmental ecosystems within which this has to manifest itself because of the particular extractive model of economic development that has been the norm or the accompaniment of modernity as we know it. So we've got to figure out how to do this in a difficult economic environment, in a context where we've got to figure out how to redesign everything so that the resource efficiency element is more logical. But we also have to do it within a context of what one at best can call asymmetrical globalization, right? So this is the process within which these processes are unfolding, but the context within which cities and city governments and national states have to figure out their room to maneuver is incredibly constrained, right? So this is some of the dynamics. So the following is just charts that you all would be very familiar with. As we all know, Asia and Africa is the big story. In Africa itself, these cities are going through a massive, massive explosion. These are the largest cities, above 3 million people. And as you can see from this particular graph, a city like Kinshasa, for example, will go up to almost 18 million people by 2025. This is a city with an infrastructural footprint that is designed for about 300,000 people, right? It's already at about anything between 8 and 10 million people. We literally have no idea how the city reproduces itself, right? Because there's just no correlation between the infrastructural holding capacity of the space, of the territory, and everything that happens there. However, the real story in Africa is less the megacities. It's the fact that the vast majority, like in most all other urban areas of the world, if you use a typology by size, that the majority of urbanites live in cities with less than 500,000 people. Now, the good thing about this is it gives you a manageable scale within which to intervene. The awful thing about this is that there's zero economic base in most of those urban centers, right? Or at least zero formal economic base in most of those centers. You don't have a tax base that you can draw on to begin to intervene. But we'll come back to that. But to really understand what this means over the next 40 years, the key thing that I want to just take you through is a set of forecast models that the Party Center with a South African-based research group have produced last year that give us some insight into the future. Now, why this is important is because I want to then get on to how the debate about the urban question is being led and framed by private sector think tanks at the moment, right? Like McKinsey, Monitor, and so forth. But before I get on to that, so what this shows you is a projection. So for this particular study, it's the International Futures Forecasting Model. It's pretty robust. It's been around for about 40 years. They've subdivided the continent into these 5 regions. This is the population or the demographic explosion up to 2025. Now, what is significant here is East and West Africa. As you can see, they're going to go through a massive demographic boom. Southern and North Africa is pretty stabilized, and then the other big transition will be in Central Africa. Now, what I want to draw your attention to here is if you look at a couple of metrics, particularly the poverty line at $2 a day, what you will see is that over the next 40 years, on the back of this explosion, is that in a place like Central Africa, poverty will continue to rise dramatically. If you look at Western Africa, poverty will continue to rise dramatically over that period. Now, I draw your attention to this because most of these people will exacerbate a really complex mobility dynamic between rural and urban areas across the continent. And again, from a response point of view, how does one figure this is important. Furthermore, if you look at a GDP per capita number, now the US is anything between $48,000 to $55,000 per capita at the moment. So this is the scale on the left. As you can see, most regions at the moment is below $1,000 per capita, right? So this is really fundamental because this goes to the heart of the basic resource available within a society to begin to respond. And one of the things that is clear to us is that if a design intervention or response isn't able to deal with what one can call in World Bank speak affordability, there's a real problem. Right? So affordability both from a household reproductive point of view, but also in terms of what the state can manage within a society. Now, as you can see, the only 2 regions that is going to have any dramatic improvement, and even this is still below $15,000 per capita, is of course the consolidated regions, which is North Africa and Southern Africa. Southern Africa is skewed because of South Africa and the size of the population within the region. Now, why all of that is incredibly frightening is because South Africa, the continent already has a Gini coefficient of 0.54. Now, this is dramatic in a context where the demographic explosion is yet to happen, where we don't really have an industrial economic base, right? So if you look at Latin America, we can understand high levels of inequality there. But what explains that? And if you look at those dynamics in the forward projection with an inequality level at that point already, you can just begin to imagine some of the complexities we're going to deal with. So within that context, of course, the UN Habitat data on the prevalence of slums is, of course, the highest in Africa. But this differentiated picture that they offered for the first time in 2008 is really instructive. What this shows is that if households have 3 to 4 of the deficiencies in the definition, they fall in this category. So if you look at Southern Asia, even though you've got a high proportion of the population, of course a very large population, living in slum conditions, the proportion living in extremely deficient conditions is actually manageable. It's relatively modest, right? And this is, again, something that sets it apart. So if you then contrast the level of access to basic services across for sub-Saharan Africa with other regions, you can see on almost every single metric it's below 50% or below 40%, right? Now, this is important to bear in mind because when we're talking about a doubling of the current urban population against this economic backdrop and the systemic drivers of it, and this is the current condition, you can just begin to imagine the scale of the enormity of the intervention or the infrastructural challenge to deal with some of this. Now, despite this really dramatic picture, what is clear if you're in an organization like mine and you speak to a range of people all the time, is that there's no doubt that there's a profound policy vacuum at the level of multilateral agencies like the African Development Bank or the Development Bank of Southern Africa or UN Habitat, et cetera, across the continent. And what has happened in the last 5 years, interestingly enough, is that global think tanks like McKinsey and so on have stepped into the breach to provide a perspective. But before I get to that, I just want to offer you a quick summary of what, in our view, are the reasons for this policy vacuum, right? So the first point to make, and some of this work I've written up in various places, so there's a more elaborate argument than the stylized summary that I will offer you now. But it is fairly clear that most post-colonial governments in Africa simply don't understand what is going on, and that there's little appetite to engage with urbanization. This is not unrelated to the fact that often political opposition in these societies fester within the cities and within slums, right? So if you look at Kenya, if you look at Zimbabwe, etc., this is where political opposition have managed to get a foothold, is within the cities. The second really difficult challenge, which I've alluded to before, is that because you're talking about 70% of non-agricultural employment being in the informal economy, and you're talking essentially about outside of South Africa, that is, of economic life that is in the domain of the informal, your tax base is tiny, right? So you've got inattentive governments, a policy vacuum, and you don't have resources to intervene, right? And of course, there's an interface between these things. Thirdly, despite the prevalence of informality, most regulatory regimes penalize informality. And then the other really important driver of unequal response or distribution of investment is, of course, the prevalence of identity politics across most African polities. And this, of course, is a legacy of the post-colonial inheritance, whole range of complicated reasons for that Mahmoud Mamdani has set out in some of his work. But this is really an important factor to bear in mind. Furthermore, Africa is entering the global economy with very limited leverage in how it inserts itself or positions itself. And of course, with new investors from China, from India, Arab states, and so forth, that are very interested in particular geographies of investment that can ensure that certain resources find their way back to their markets, this is a problem. Moreover, there's very little unified response on this in terms of intra-Africa responses, right? Another big story. And finally, the costs of what one can only define as large-scale urban dysfunction is essentially paid by slum dwellers who are politically voiceless and often not that well organized, as we see in some South Asian and Latin American cities. So this is just one stylized account. It's a much more complicated story, but just so that you get some sense of what our views are on why we think the situation persists. To turn now to some of the private sector work, fantastic report by McKinsey, Lions on the Move, as you know, the reference, of course, is the Asian tigers. So Africa's got lions, and kind of making an argument that Africa's the next big story. This is where investment is happening. Investors pay attention. This is really important, and the argument is crafted in a very compelling way, contrasting Africa to the other success stories in the world and so forth, and showing over the last decade what kind of growth levels you've been looking at. Furthermore, demonstrating that over a 4-year period post-2004, return on investment for global investors was higher in Africa than in any other region. Furthermore, showing that by 2040, the largest workforce in the world will be in Africa, and so on and so on and so on. Monitor produced a really interesting report called Africa from the Bottom Up, for all those radical planners in the room. Cities, economic growth, and prosperity in sub-Saharan Africa. And essentially, the argument that they're making, in italics at the bottom, is that urbanization is a good thing. Celebrate it, embrace it. It turbocharges growth and diversification. It enhances productivity, increases employment opportunity, etc., etc. Now, this, of course, is part of a much larger shift within private capital, right, where there's a recognition that consumer markets in the north are saturated, and that the big sweet spot is the growth of cities in the global south, right? Look at the differential there. This is produced by the Boston Consulting Group, a report that they've done. And of course, within that, what they're really keen to do is to segment the middle class, where consumption is going to grow. This is just from another report of theirs on the global middle class, where they show you in China and India the kind of exponential growth in the middle classes over a 5-year period, right? So this is the big obsession. More recently, McKinsey's produced another report, Urban World, where they show that the 60 largest cities by GDP accounts for 60% of global output, and so takes cities seriously, etc., etc., etc. Within all of the storyline, of course, even assumptions that Africa matters, look at that. Africa almost as urbanized as China and has as many cities of 1 million people as Europe. You get a flavor of the discourse, right? Now, the point of all of this is that what this translates into is a particular take on how to think about the investment challenge to equip these cities to be a basis for this kind of growth. This is from a report produced by the World Bank in 2010, where they trawled every bit of data to try and measure the exact deficit in infrastructure for Africa. And they came to this number, 95 billion needed per annum to deal with the backlog and keep up with future growth, segmented by those infrastructures. Also came to the conclusion that this fell about 50 billion short of what the current levels are. And so the big question, of course, becomes what kind of infrastructure does get prioritized? And what kind of cities is that producing? And how equipped are those cities to respond to some of these challenges? What I can tell you, it's clear, the built manifestation of current investment patterns is what one can call extreme splintered urbanism, right? So you've got slum neglect combined with enclave elite urbanism. So you've got some of the most fantastical new urbanism, gated, of course, even though that would be a paradox for new urbanist disciples. But given the kind of social insecurity, you cannot have your new urbanism without its gate in our particular cities and context. But this is generally the context. Now, within this then, what you find is that practitioners, they're caught between these various forces. You've got weak and patronage-driven states, no vision of what they want for their cities, planning and regulatory systems that are completely outmoded, inappropriate. You've got highly skewed private sector investment priorities, and of course, fragmented civil society positionalities within this. And this is really the context within which one has got to think about how to frame thinking about these cities and how to potentially respond. So in this part of the talk, I will briefly go over just one or two snippets of work that we've produced in a collaborative way with people from the academy across the continent, from some of the development bodies and so on. In 2008, we convened 32 people in Cape Town for a week, and we kind of went over what I've just presented to you. And we said, you know, as a group of Africans, how do we think about this? What is the agenda that we are putting forward to begin to think about both a research and a policy and a practice response to this? And it came down to these 7, if you will, entry points, 7 thematics. The first is to really pay attention to what we call open source social infrastructure organizational models, right? The importance of people who are caught within this vortex in slums to be organized, to respond. Secondly, to deal with the crisis of employment, but to think about that crisis in relation to how to make these settlements livable, both in social and environmental terms. Thirdly, and I suppose in many ways centrally, because of the longitudinal impacts, infrastructure-led actions of urban reform that is not just about economic boosterism, but really tries to respond to the nexus between economic growth imperatives and social and environmental challenges and how that coalesces in cities. Fundamentally in our context and much of the global south is appropriate land use and land value policies and regulation. Effective accountability, and of course the big other story that I don't have time to get into, is the wave of democratization and decentralization of the last 20 years. In fits and starts, highly uneven, but still it's there, and some scope for rethinking local accountabilities. And of course something that isn't often mentioned, but the importance of robust institutions and networks. You can't really think of these things in the absence of effective institutions. And finally, paying attention to data, to numbers, to knowledge, and how we aggregate that, how we use it to inform decision making. A stylized way in which we then basically frame the big challenge for African cities at this particular moment is to pay attention to the impossible circle to be squared, right? How do you achieve growth in a context of asymmetrical globalization where you're locked into particular growth paths, highly extractive with all of its manifestations? Reduce emissions, in other words, build in a different way, but at the same time raise human development indicators, right? Education, health, and so on outcome. How do you do that simultaneously? And within that, what's the role of cities to facilitate this particular kind of logic? We then translate the response into the following frame, that we argue that there's 4 operating systems that has to manifest in any city: your infrastructure operating system, economic and spatial form, that at the heart of that, of course, is your governance system. Infrastructure we think of in 2 terms: the social infrastructure, which is about neighborhood, about settlement, and network infrastructures, which is about the city region, a very different scale, very different logic of got to drive, but there's got to be an articulation of that. And I don't have time to go into all of this, but the economic issue is really about how to think of economic enrollment outside of the idea of a formal job, because Africa's economic trajectory is not going to be rural industrial services. We've got a completely different economic dynamic where structural unemployment is a permanent feature, right? So what does that mean? How do you think about that economic frame, and what's the built environment manifestation of that? And of course, paying attention to the fact that these debates and discourses are fundamentally rooted in cultural dispositions. So unless the cultural frame is brought into the discussion, you end up with a technocratic discussion, and that is not going to help anybody. I won't go into this. We're busy at the moment experimenting this frame with what we call Future Cape 2040, which is a kind of laboratory with the regional government and the metropolitan government in Cape Town, where we're exploring under these labels or headings what these things may mean in that particular territory. I can come back to that. Of course, what sits behind it is some ideas that you'd all be very familiar with. This idea that you've got to change the resource metabolic dynamic within cities. But what we say is that how do you do that in a way that drives job creation and growth, right? So it's a very different kind of argument. The research agenda that then flows from this, and here what we need is both better data, but also comparative analysis, right? Is really to think about form and flow of cities with infrastructures, the connecting thread. Help and try and understand what are the different kind of metabolism that we have, and what does that mean for the current land use and spatial dynamics, and how does the current form of economic and social reproductive demand shape these things. Now, we just don't have this data, right? So, of course, the next step would be to do the analysis and to give an account of this, but at the moment, we're just still trying to work out how do we get to the first base to think of this. And, of course, all of this, again, the missing link, the institutional dimensions of this. The next step is to use this debate and recast this debate on sustainable infrastructure, both network, as I explained earlier, and social infrastructures, and to begin to think about these kinds of questions, right, as some of the empirical research agendas that we need to flesh out. I won't go through the detail of this again. I can come back to it. Now, what seems clear to us methodologically, that you can't answer these questions without a fundamental commitment to co-production, right? In other words, you've got to decenter the university, you've got to decenter what I call the Baroque institution called the university, and embed urbanists within this network of knowledge producers and space makers as a way of figuring out how to answer some of these questions. So I'll now conclude with just a very brief overview of what the African Center for Cities is as a work in progress. We deliberately work at 5 scales at our university, the University of Cape Town. We've got a big research program in Cape Town, which is run through 6 labs. At a national level, we convene every 2 years all the urbanists to try and build an interdisciplinary academic conversation, and half of the papers are PhD students and half are established academics. And then we run a number of programs in Africa. The largest one is an association of African planning schools, 47 planning schools in 15 African countries, mainly Anglophone, meet and try and co-produce new curriculum to begin to deal with some of these questions, right? So most of the professionals that we engage with at the moment, or that we produce out of our universities, are simply inadequately trained or equipped to respond to some of these questions. So what we've done is to create a platform for curriculum renewal and co-production, linked to a research agenda to produce case studies. And I invite all of you to kind of, who's going to do fantastic work in Africa and elsewhere, to feed the case studies through, because the point is that you can't transact these new perspectives without the case study material to transact with, right, to open up these questions. And then we've got a partnership with the Institute of Human Settlements in Bangalore in India, and run an international program in the Global South that looks at the relationship between informal work and planning regulatory regimes in partnership with an advocacy network called WeGo. And this is a combination of new statistical techniques to measure the informal economy with a review of planning law mechanisms and so forth. The Africa program, I don't have time. So just very briefly then, this is kind of the dynamic we try and reinforce in the center, right? Research connected with policy application and social practices, trying to draw out learning. So for example, across the 6 labs that we run in Cape Town, the lab conveners have just completed a joint paper where they've reflected on the methodological implications of co-production, right? Because each of these labs have had a very different experience, and we're trying to speak back to a larger literature on methodology and epistemology and co-production. And then we run an MPhil program in infrastructure design and management, and I facilitate a PhD seminar series. And at the heart of this, we really believe, and this is why cityscapes is something that we've prioritized, is that unless we can articulate these questions in the public domain in a different set of registers and discourses, it is very difficult to get traction in the larger world. And finally, in a way, the center is by design hybrid and experimental, and it's unfolding, right? And what I try and do is to create fundamentally a respect across the urban fields for people who work with numbers, because clearly unless we can build the data sets to actually understand what is going on empirically and to do some forecasting, you're kind of whistling in the wind, right? But at the same time, to reduce everything to a slum figure, to reduce everything to these aggregate numbers, takes you away from the detailed understanding that's required that qualitative work can give you. So how do you continuously ensure that there's a dialogue between the quants and the qualitative people? The work, of course, is really about engaging with real-life problems associated with this form of urbanism. So it's a kind of a grounded pragmatism, and I mean that both in the philosophical sense and in the disposition that applied work is important. But at the same time, and this is very much where some of my work is that there's no way that you can really, in, if you will, phenomenological terms, engage with the consequences of dysfunctionality in the way that I've described it and not feel that you're staring into the abyss, right? This is pretty depressing shit, right? I mean, this is hectic stuff. And in a way, you reach a certain point that Lefebvre says the only, if you will, security blanket we have at the end is the arts, right? That you've got to turn to the aesthetic. You've got to turn to artistic registers to help us to assuage the pain, the incredible trauma associated with staring down the abyss, but importantly recognizing that that precipice at the abyss is fundamentally important to do the other stuff, right? You cannot let go of that, because that's what's required to come to terms with what African cities mean in this time and what it may become. Thank you.
We have time for questions. I'll just sort of open by asking Edgar, I mean, it would be useful if you might take a minute or two to tell us about a specific project, like you were telling me earlier about the question of density and the research you're doing. I think that would help young people.
Okay. Yeah, so we run in Cape Town these 6 city labs, and essentially these labs bring together public offices in the metropolitan and state level government with sometimes private sector people and NGO activists and, of course, academics. And the basic methodologies, they run for about 2.5 years. In the first 6 months, people meet on a monthly basis to just kind of get to know each other, figure out what are the shared questions, and disabuse each other of all the stereotypes and so on that everybody comes into the room. And we've, as I said, we're in the concluding phase of the first 6, and it's been incredible. I mean, they've all had an absolutely unique biography. They've all gone in very different directions. And the one that Rahul is referring to is One where we looked at the central business district of Cape Town, which is about 1.5% of the 3.8 million of the population in the city, but accounts for 40% of the general value add in the regional economy, right? So it's very significant, it's really important. It's the economic heartland of the city. And one of the partnership public bodies, it's a kind of a hybrid central business improvement district, but it's not quite that, it's anyway. They, in their spatial vision for this territory, said that we need to treble the density of this particular part of the city. So what we did was, over the last 2 years, we convened. We said, okay, this is interesting, so let's try and understand how this is going to come about. How is it going to be realized, right? So we identified all of the public and private investors for this territory with investments above R1 billion. That's about divide by 9, and you get to the dollar figure. So let's say $110 million. And let's ask them to reflect on what the social housing and the infrastructural implications will be of their investments. And we literally pieced together this puzzle over 2 years. And they've, of course, never sat in the same room. They've never put their various plans and spatial visions for these territories next to each other. And it was remarkable. And the conclusion we've arrived to, we're busy editing the volume now, is that density in 10 years' time will be lower than what it is now, right? So because they're all catering for an income group that will be able to afford a larger floor space per capita, basically. And most of the large private economic investment will be for service companies where most of the staff will live in the suburbs and so on. Especially since the public transport infrastructure has been improved, and so people coming into the city and the road infrastructure, that pressure has been taken away. So there's less need for people to want to live in the central city in those income groups. That's one example. Another example is an area called Philippi, which is next to the second largest transport node in Cape Town. Fascinating area, really well located, very, very poor. About 50% informal dwellings, 50% built stock, formerly built stock. Very high levels of poverty, small households, 1 to 2, so it's a kind of intermediate space for young people when they leave parents' home while looking for work and so on. And because of its location, it's always been identified as this really priority area. So lots of government programs, lots of civil society groups, and yet very little happens, right? So what we were trying to understand was institutional misfit. Why is it that you've got all this government attention, all this civil society capability, and yet the outcomes, the return on those, if you will, investments have been so pathetic? And the findings of that have been really, really interesting. But again, the process of bringing together these different people to ask this question about disconnect specifically has been fascinating. And I think from that work, we'll be able to really respond intelligently to some of the debates on the tyranny of participation and why civil society state mismatch happens and so on and so on. And yeah, I can go on. There's many more questions.
Thank you for coming to talk. I had a pretty simple question. What are some ways that students from the U.S. or us basically can engage with ACC?
Yeah, good question. We're kind of figuring that out because
or in the near future.
no, we get students all the time, in fact. Wanting to engage. And to be honest, we're not really very well geared for it at the moment, so it's something we've got to reflect on. So there's 2 issues at play. One is we're just hosting now, literally when I go back, a group from Stockholm. It's a group of art and architecture and design students coming out to do, it's not quite a studio, but something like it. So I've connected them with the architecture department at my university, and we will do a kind of a framing set of sessions and a concluding set of sessions at the end. But my agreement with them was we're happy to host them, but then they have to pay for 8 African students to join the studio from universities in the network that we're busy working with. And they agreed to that. And so for us, the issue is we welcome it. We think it's fantastic, and it can contribute tremendously to the kind of knowledge project we're busy with. But that we have to then have an honest conversation about the political economy of knowledge production between the North and the South. and how do we ensure that we use these processes, which of course will, I think, be very enriching for students like yourselves, as a way to also really contribute sensitively to the searching process we've got going, but also enhance the capacity of our universities to help our students to have that experience as well. Secondly, to then also explore as part of that conversation how our students can come and do a studio in Boston, right? So I think that that kind of both ways engagement is just, for me at least, a precondition for having the conversation about structuring these partnerships.
Hi, thank you. I'm very interested in how all of this foreign direct investment is actually going into infrastructural developments taking place now. Are there public-private, kind of public works authorities? What is their means of actually engaging with these public institutions?
Okay. It varies tremendously, of course, given the institutional limitations of the state. It's taken for granted that you need a version of public-private partnerships to be the delivery mechanisms. The problem, though, is that in my reading, at least, of that literature and from some evaluation experience that I personally have, is that a public-private partnership is effective when you have a strong state that is able to set the regulatory frame and can produce a good terms of reference for that, so that accountability works well. If you don't have that, what they tend to do is they respond to a very narrow understanding of what the market demands or needs. And so I'm really worried about that, because I think that there's an institutional model that is being imposed that is disconnected from a discussion about how to strengthen the state to manage these institutions well. The other kind of problem is that capital coming from particularly China is often linked to institutional management models that one requires Chinese citizens to run them and to work in them. And even in the actual projects, then the public works or other forms of projects associated with them, even there, Chinese companies then give preference to do the actual delivery, down to even, sort of the lower level of labor, not just management. And of course, that's just totally unacceptable. Interestingly enough, the Zambian elections, I don't know how many of you may have followed that, amongst all of your primary debates, I know there's very little attention span for any other democratic processes in the world, but the Zambian elections about 4 months ago was fascinating, because the election turned on this question of the two candidates' view of China, right, and China's role in Zambia. And it was fascinating. And the person who won the election won it on an anti-Chinese ticket. Right. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That's not the point. The point is that I think that China is now, its sunken investment on the continent is now beyond a tipping point, right? So China can't leave anymore. So the power relation between Chinese investment banks and Chinese government and so on, I think has gone into a different phase. And we're in an interesting moment now where African governments are feeling more confident to at least begin to negotiate the terms of investment. Where that is going to go, etc., I mean, it's anybody's guess, and I think it varies from country to country, but it's not an uncomplicated kind of new form of neo-colonial. That's not the story. That would be missing a more complicated dynamic. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. This is just an artist that has done a fantastic essay for an exhibition that we ran in Cape Town. So her name is Sid Willows.
Thank you. A specific question on energy infrastructure. There's a lot of hydro energy dependence. And with climate change, the variability of the rainfall, etc., there's some energy security issues. Any prioritization, like you said in your slide of the $50 billion happening towards shifting to renewable energy and alternative sources?
Yeah. This is really kind of way out of my field, but I'll say a few things. But take it with, a reasonable measure of salt. In southern Africa, there's a very interesting debate around the Congo. So the projections are the capacity of the Congo to provide hydro energy for the region is kind of unlimited. It's just so massive. So there's a big set of maneuvers happening between China and other players to really make that the centerpiece of energy security over the next 20, 30, 40 years and investment around that and so on. But because of its transnational dimensions and implications, it's a very complicated negotiation. And the political economy in the region is really tricky, and no least because South Africa, of course, sits on massive coal deposits, and the South African and Southern Africa energy system is still entirely reliant on coal, right? So South Africa is as a key player in this, is confronted with a challenge that it makes sense to do the hydro investments in Congo and to kind of be part of that story. Not least because of South Africa's own commitments to wean itself off coal and to reduce emissions related to coal and so on. But at the same time, it has very little leverage in this new agenda, right? And so it's playing a really tricky game. So that's the one set of debates going on. The other, of course, is in the Sahel, and the big kind of renewable project for Europe is this massive energy project in the Sahara Desert. And although in the way that particular, what do you call it, a coalition is stacked, this is really about Europe's energy security, right? So this is the EU's big long-term agenda. And the terms of Africa's involvement, apart from being the repository for where these things will be, is completely unclear at the moment, and they're not part in the way of that negotiation and discussion. That said, there's of course a very lively and active sustainable energy set of actors and movements and so on across the continent, and some colleagues of mine who's working on the connection between slum upgrading and renewable energy is looking at a localized model of energy production and generation, and is running a set of pilots in 6 or 7 different slum areas across eastern and southern Africa with Slum Dwellers International, with Gates Foundation funding. And the idea is to see whether you can build a business model of the production of these localized instruments, and both in terms of supply and routine maintenance and so on. So it's a really dynamic field. I mean, there's some big stuff happening up here around the big long-term security issues, and then really inflected by the kind of regional political economy dynamics. And then there's this really interesting, more localized experiments, which, it's too early to tell how promising that is, but I think it is very, very exciting.
My question is, do you see any urban models from the US or Europe that are being sort of misused in Africa? Like they're making repeated mistakes that we've made and we've learned from, but they're remaking for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I can show you images of South African suburbs, you think you're in the States. So it's, I mean, the basic morphology and the template for middle-class, privately driven investment in housing and settlement is really off the shelf. I mean, it's, there's no attempt at localization or customization and so on. So thank you very much for, that particular influence in our societies. And it's kind of worse than that, because what is happening at the moment is a lot of the firms who's doing the building, they kind of course, they don't want to put any R&D into any kind of customization or localization for context. And because their business models have kind of all been worked out at certain scales and certain volumes and so on and so on. So they literally just kind of plonk these things in. And the problem is that they come hand in toe with the investment community. And so it's all a very neat and easy and kind of turnkey issue, outside of the purview of either any kind of democratic accountability and so on and so on. So, I mean, so it's really problematic, right? the other dynamic to that is that the firms that are building, they're continent-wide. Okay, they're global and they're continent-wide, and so it's really easy for them to just dump these things in. And then finally, the other phenomena that's happening more recently is dumping, right? Technological dumping, because of the raising of environmental standards in the EU context in particular, where certain kind of product lines are no longer viable. You kind of dump them in African cities. So, and again, this goes back to the investment pressure, because there's such a desperate need for investment. Kind of any investment is welcome, and so you have this mismatch. But part of it is that I think, to take some responsibility in that I think, our urbanists, our architects, our planners, our designers, whatever, we have not been articulate and explicit enough about just how problematic this is. And when we are, it is often dressed up in a very academic discourse that is all about neoliberal kind of dissemination of urbanistic models, which is okay, of course, but that's kind of a very precious academic point to be made. There isn't a way of articulating how problematic this is in terms that either public offices or the private sector can understand, and that's really the big gap.
So Edgar is going to be around till Saturday evening. He's going to participate in the conference that we're doing starting Friday afternoon at 2:30 and all day Saturday called Conditions and Projections. It's going to be 5 panels with 2 panelists each. It's going to be very interesting. So Edgar's going to be part of that. So any member wants to talk with him more, he's going to be around for the next 2 days. Thanks very much.
Thank you.